And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils. They shall speak with new tongues. They shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover.
It's kind of amazing that my great-grandmother is still alive and just as sharp as she was in her younger years. Of course, being almost 90, she has slowed down just a tad, but she's still just as fiery, and her memory hasn't lost its edge. She has a lot of stories in her, my granny, and every time she shares one with me, I make sure to pay close attention. It's not every day you get to listen to someone who's been through what she has. My family comes from West Virginia, generations of poor Alpatchian miners and mountain folk who take pride in their histories. Granny is no exception. She's witnessed wars and depression, not to mention burying both her husband and son, who died from dementia a few years ago. But she's a tough old bird, and I enjoy my visits to her house. I realise as I get older she starts telling me stories I haven't heard before. I guess I'm enough of an adult now to know about family secrets. Nothing too shocking, just tales of Pop's days as a moonshiner, or about the baby she lost soon after the war. I like hearing these stories because it gives me a deeper understanding of my family. And I like hearing about what my grandmother was like as a rebellious teen in the 1950s. One story, though, was different. I don't even know what prompted her to tell me the tale. But it was a late evening in July when I heard it. It was such a warm night. I brought a watermelon over for the two of us to share after supper, and we sat there on the porch in the twilight, enjoying the sweet taste of melon and watching the fireflies begin to light up the pastures below. I was spitting seeds over the porch, seeing how far I could shoot the bastards. And Granny laughed that I was going to turn her sunflower garden into a watermelon patch come August. As we enjoyed the evening, cool Granny became thoughtful, retreating into her memories for a time. She did that now and again, and it never bothered me. Having lived a life as hers, I assumed she had a lot of memories to keep in line. Suddenly, she began to tell me a story from her past. A story that I'll keep with me until I pass away. Throughout the southern parts of the state, scattered deep in the mountains, are remains of old towns and vacant coal camps. You won't find them on the map, but if you know where to look and enjoy a good hike through the hills, you'll eventually stumble across one of these ghost towns. A few have already been demolished, and some have just collapsed over the years from weather and time, but a good number lay sleeping in the hills. A lot of these coal towns dried up after the closing of the local mine due to an accident, economy, or just when the ore veins are all puttered out. Since the mining company owned the property and all the buildings on said property, then there was no reason to keep a mine in operation in the area, and the whole town was shut down and abandoned. No coal, no business. It was pretty common in the old days, before the unions, and even afterwards it was still a possibility. Willow Fork was one such town, nestled deep in the southern hills, with the company houses built into neat rows. Granny and Pop moved to the town soon after Pop came home from Germany and got a job in the mines. Pop came from a long line of coal miners. It was his life, and he was proud of the work and proud of the union. It was modest pay, what with a wife and 5 children to support. But he and other men toiled under the mountains to mine the coal deep within. It was dangerous work, and the prospect of a cave-in or explosion was always present. Maybe that's why so many West Virginians are devout in their faith. Baptist, Methodist, Pentecostal. Each miner knew the sinner's prayer by heart, and every Sunday the churches were packed with mining families, giving thanks to the Lord that none of the men had died in an accident during the week. Religion was a big part of the community, and it seemed everyone in town was a member of some church and had a place for God in their lives. There was one church, though, that was a little different from the others. It was tucked away from Willow Fork, nestled in a hollow to the north, not far from the yawning entrance to the mine. It was a small white wooden building with tiny windows, and painted on the pitched roof were the words, Church of the Shepherd's Flock. The congregation was led by the Reverend Gerald Roberts, a fire and brimstone preacher, who some believed was a prophet. He would claim that the Lord had spoken to him on such and such day, and talk of the rapture was always a topic he relished. While some people in town believed him to speak of the living word, others regarded the man with a mixture of contempt and fear. Along with claiming to be a prophet, the Reverend also encouraged his flock to take part in the handling of snakes. It's rooted in the belief that if one's faith is strong enough, then the Lord will protect the believer from the venom of snakes, as well as that of poison, and also be able to heal the sick. The congregation gets whipped up into a frenzy, seized by the Holy Ghost, and begins to talk, and begins to speak in tongues as a spirit. Copperheads are brought out and held by the members of the church, sometimes biting believer or remaining docile during the services. Other times, members of the church will drink poisons like strychnine and remain unaffected afterwards. If someone does fall ill, the congregation will gather round and lay hands on the body as they attempt to heal the stricken. People have died for their faith by doing this, but the tradition continues even to this day. West Virginia is one of the few states that allow the practice of snake handling to continue. Of course, not everyone in Willow Fork agreed with the practice. Some preached that it was an act of vanity and pride to try and tempt the Lord with such behaviour. Others said they weren't seized by the Holy Spirit at all, but instead possessed by the devil himself, and that the Reverend was a false prophet. They that did belong to the Church of the Shepherd's Flock, however, truly believed in the words of Reverend Roberts and the power of the Spirit when they took the serpents and poison. They were fanatical to their beliefs, zealots to their faith. In the summer of 49, life in Willow Fork seemed serene. My grandmother was a bored 13-year-old, and work in the mines was thriving, even if the pay was small. Granny and Pop worked hard to provide a safe home for their family, like everyone else in town. And despite being poor, things seemed okay. The only thing happening was Reverend Roberts' tent revival in a few days. Tent revivals were always happening in the summer. It was perfect weather for the 3-day events, with all the food and singing and baptisms in the stream. Granny's church had just held theirs a few weeks ago up in Little Beaver, and a few new souls had been brought to the Lord. Maybe it was the preaching, or maybe it was the delicious fried chicken that won them over. People looked forward to revivals, but Church of the Shepherd's Flock was different. They held theirs in the clearing outside of the church. Pop and the other men watched as the worn canvas tent was slowly raised in the dirt clearing by the road. Now Pop was a tall, strong man of German stock and respected in town. He had toured in Germany during the war and saw his share of fighting, so nothing in Willow Fork seemed to scare him in the slightest. However, on his way to work that morning, he spotted the Reverend, and something inside of him shuddered. Robert's eyes were lit with a fiery glow and a crazed possession that Pop hadn't seen in any man before. Were he a Catholic, he'd have crossed himself right there, but instead he just looked away and continued to the mines with his lunch bucket and cap. There were other things to worry about besides a zealous preacher, like explosions or cave-ins. One man who worked with Pop was named Jake Whitaker. His wife was a member of Robert's church, but he didn't want anything to do with it.
Speaking in tongues, laying of hands, that I understand,
he would say.
But snakes? The minute I see a rattler or a copperhead, I'm done. If holding snakes proves I'm a Christian, then I guess I'll take my chances.
His wife Ida was constantly on him to join her and the children at church, and would always worry over the status of his soul. She'd finally worn him down, and he agreed to attend the revival with her that evening. He wasn't looking forward to it, but Jake loved his wife, and if it made her happy and brought some peace to the house, then he supposed one night wouldn't kill him. The other miners chuckled and nodded. A nagging wife just wasn't worth it. But Pop still felt something chewing at him after seeing Roberts that morning. He hadn't felt this kind of anxiety since the time he was in France during the war, when suddenly the line had shifted and he and his men had suddenly found themselves in enemy territory. They'd hidden in the cellar of a kind farmer, but leading up to the moment, Pop just knew something was in the air. Now he felt the same way after hearing Jake talk about the revival, but he dismissed it and continued to work. Work ended and the men walked home down the wide road, thankful for another day done. Once again, Pop passed the dirty canvas tent, now upright and ready for the revival, and once again he felt the sense of creeping dread in the pit of his gut. Young men were carrying wooden snake cages into the tent, as well as mason jars filled with what looked like rusty water. He knew that sometimes strychnine was drank as a testament of faith, and wondered if that was what the jars contained. But strychnine was a white powder. The poison drink was created when it was mixed into water. Did it turn the water into such a hue of orange? Again he felt the sense of dread, and as he watched the setup continue, he suddenly locked eyes with the Reverend. Gerald Roberts' eyes burned with such zeal and fire as he looked at the coal miner. Roberts was no mean a large man, in fact he was easily dwarfed by Pop, but the power and energy that man exuded was enough to topple any seasoned GI. The preacher smiled, his white teeth glistening in the light, and Pop was suddenly reminded of the flashing of bayonets.
Why don't you come and join us, Brother John? Lest you ignore the voice calling in the wilderness.
That's quite alright. He fumbled over his words, feeling uneasy over the fact that Roberts had spoken his name. I know where I stand with the Lord. He started to walk away, but the preacher called out to him once more.
It's a frightful thing to fall into the hands of the living God, John.
That evening, Granny and the children were cleaning up after supper in the kitchen as Pop listened to the radio. It was a wrestling match broadcasted out of Beckley, and Pop loved wrestling. Usually would get worked up over the match, yelling and hollering as the announcer detailed the chaos in the ring. But tonight he was still troubled by his meeting with Reverend Roberts and the strange liquid. Something wasn't right. He wasn't sure what it was he had felt when he first laid eyes on the jars or the presence of the preacher, but slowly it dawned on him as the second match started. He had felt the hand of the devil touch his soul. He shuddered and took a drink of his Dr. Pepper. Granny knew something troubled her husband, but didn't press. If he needed to tell her, he would. As she finished washing the last of the dishes, a blue Ford pickup erratically drove up to the front gate before parking. The driver's door opened and out fell Jake Whittaker, his white dress shirt and pants covered in blood.
John!
He yelled, picking himself up and running to the door of the small company house.
John, come quick!
Pop quickly went to the door and opened it to see a panicked, blood-soaked Jake. Jesus Christ, Jake.
It's Ida. It's that damn preacher. They've all gone insane. You gotta come with me, John. Something evil has taken hold of everyone. My kids, John. She killed our kids.
Pop grabbed the hunting rifle off the mantel and turned to his wife before heading out to the truck. "Don't let the children out, and don't come looking for me, okay?" "John, be careful," Granny yelled after him. She felt the same dread her husband felt as she watched the blue truck speed off, followed by a number of other trucks. Jake must have alerted the other men in the town before coming to their house, forming a posse to inspect the scene. She quickly shut the door and bolted it, telling the children to do the same with the back door as well as the windows. Whatever was out in the woods might be coming to the village. As Pop drove the truck, Jake rambled about the revival. It started like any other prayers and gospel singing as the congregation felt the Holy Spirit take possession of them. Jake had sat near the back with his wife and children, a son and daughter, as the rest of the congregation testified and sang. He felt out of place and a little uneasy, but his wife was so happy to have him there. Like a real family, she had stated. Soon the Reverend entered and began his usual hellfire preaching, talking of the apocalypse and the wrath of the Lamb. He continued to speak of the visions he had seen from the Lord and the message of destruction he was to spread.
"True faith has vanished,"
he proclaimed,
"and the lambs are easily pulled from the narrow path into the wilderness."
Then the devil appeared to him, he claimed, and said that if he really did love the Lord, then he would drink of this cup. Roberts then gestured to the mason jars behind him. The devil himself had given him the poison, stronger than any made by hands of man.
"But the power of the Lord is stronger,"
he cried. The congregation praised the Lord, shouts of Amen erupting in the seats. Roberts took a jar and held it up before the people. He would show the devil just how unshakable his faith was, and if anyone wanted to join him in an act of pure faith, then they would join him. Jars were distributed out as gospel music started up from the choir again. Jake suddenly felt scared as he watched the Reverend take the first drink. Just what was that poison? His wife jumped up to take a drink, urging her husband to join, but he refused and stayed behind with the children. He should have stopped her. He knew something wasn't right, but he just couldn't do it. He watched as she and a good number of people drank the rusty liquid, gagging slightly as it went down. The singing intensified and people were now speaking in tongues and clapping to the music. Those that drank the poison were even more active, jumping up and down and praising the Lord with upraised arms. Reverend Roberts was shouting now, claiming about how they just defeated the devil and how Jesus would receive them in the end time. Everyone was cheering and singing praises, until one member of the congregation doubled over and vomited a stream of blood. Others began to follow suit, and for a moment there was wild panic. But the Reverend called out for order. There was no reason to be alarmed. It was just another test of the devils. Those not afflicted began to lay their hands on the ill members and pray over their bodies. Drake quickly looked for Ida and spotted her as she slowly made her way towards him and the children. The front of her dress was soaked in blood and it dribbled out the side of her mouth. The children screamed in terror as she approached them, her arms outstretched towards her husband. "Jake," she weakly called. Another gush of blood and black vial poured from her mouth as blood began to trickle from her nose and ears. She fell to the ground, convulsing before his feet. All around them, a large number of people have done the same, and the tent walls were soon splattered with red and black. The Reverend had succumbed as well, retching and screaming in pain as a geyser of blood erupted from his mouth. Jake grabbed his wife and tried to rouse her, the children weeping in fear and terror at the chaos all around them. As Jake screamed Ida's name, her eyes snapped open, bloodshot, and stared at him for a solid 5 seconds. A grin began to divide her scarlet-stained face, ruby teeth flashing. Her gaze jerked away from Jake and locked onto her 2 young, sobbing children.
"Come to Mama,"
she wheezed. Suddenly, with a speed and strength Jake had never seen before, Ida jumped and fell upon the children. He watched, paralysed with shock, as his wife began to tear apart their small bodies, and screams of horror and pain began to fill the tent as more blood-stained faithful began to pounce onto other parishioners. There was blood and bone and gore all over the tent, and a sea of red collecting at their feet. Jake wasn't sure what happened next, but he was suddenly in his truck driving back into town, speeding and swerving like a madman. Pop's hands were white-knuckled as he listened to Jake's tale. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be true. When he and the other men reached the revival site, however, his guts were filled with icy fear. They walked towards the tent, rifles and guns ready. As the smell of blood filled their noses, the canvas fluttered in the rosy sunset, and the clearing was still. Slowly, the men advanced to the site. Jake was muttering to himself, eyes wide in shock as he walked behind Pop towards the tent. He kept repeating to himself,
"They're all dead. They're all dead. They're all dead. They're all dead."
as he pulled at his hair. The lead man was a miner named Holt. He was the first to enter, signalling the rest to wait for his signal. Upon seeing the sight within, he simply said, "Lord have mercy." "What is it, Holt?" one of the men yelled as he readied his rifle. Holt said nothing, but motioned for the others. Pop hesitated before advancing. He didn't want to know what was waiting inside. What horror the tent had in store. He'd seen enough of that in Germany, left it all behind after crossing the Atlantic back to the US. The blood, the death, the dread. Pop found his feet moving forward despite his fear. Jake was weeping like a child now. His pitiful sobs were the only sounds in the clearing. But as the group entered the tent, there were more sounds. Sounds of disgust and sounds of terror. Pop ducked in through the canvas opening and stood beside Holt, surveying the scene. The first thing he noticed was the blood. It was everywhere, the walls, the wooden podium, all over the packed dirt floor. There were bodies too. Mangled and partially devoured bodies, strung all over the tent like Christmas garland. The snake cages had been ripped open and the serpents nowhere to be found. A few of the miners became sick and quickly exited the tent while the rest stood in silent shock. Pap knelt down and picked up an empty mason jar. There was still a little rust-coloured liquid left inside. He sniffed it and quickly jerked his head away. His eyes watered and his vision blurred for a second. "What do you have, John?" one of the men asked. He handed him the jar. "Poison, probably what they drank, but I don't reckon it's strychnine."
"Devil's blood!"
Jake screamed from outside the tent. The group looked at each other with unease. There was a thick fog of evil in the room, and every man felt a chill in his bones. Holt pointed to the other side of the tent. There was a large tear in the canvas and a trail of blood leading out of it. "It looks like whatever caused this left that way." They followed the trail of blood for a few feet before realizing where it led. To the mine. As they neared the mouth of the mine, they saw them. They who drank the poison. Pop's eyes widened into horror as he watched the group slowly walk into the blackness. There were about 40 of them or so, pale as death and bathed in blood and other bodily fluids. Their eyes were gold and slit like snakes, staring straight ahead as they walked. "They're going into the mine," one of the men yelled. "Sons of bitches," another muttered, levelling his rifle at one of the faithful. Before anyone could protest, he shot the man, blowing off the top part of his head. The man staggered back for a bit before stumbling forward with the others. The shot should have killed the man. He should have fallen to the ground dead, but he didn't. He just kept walking forward. It was then that the group realised that perhaps Jake was right. What they were dealing with wasn't of this earth, but instead was pure evil. Pop was a God-fearing man, but also a rational man. Things happened for a reason, and there was a logical explanation for everything. Now, he wasn't so sure. The only thing he could think of was the Bible's talk of the dead walking the earth once more and the judgment of the living. Had Judgment Day come for them? As the men stood there in shocked silence, watching the parade of the bloody damned, Jake stood up and pointed down the road.
Ida!
He yelled in horror. The men followed his hand and saw the woman. She was the last of the group, shambling towards the mine entrance, and carried in her arms the bloody remains of what they assumed were her children. Her simple yellow dress was so soaked with blood that one would think it was red. Her blonde hair was matted with gore. Jake whimpered in terror as she passed the group, not paying the miners any heed. But as she walked, she stopped and slowly turned towards Pop and Jake. That same grin spreading across her red face. The men aimed their rifles at the woman and prepared to fire should she lunge towards them. But Ida remained still. After a few seconds, she spoke. Her voice was gravelly and low, but Pop heard her words clearly.
It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of a living God.
She turned back towards the mine and walked into the darkness with the others. Jake screamed aloud, pulling at his hair and clothing. The men tried to restrain him, but it was no use. He ran into the mine, wailing after his wife and dead children. His voice slowly faded as he went deeper into the mine before dying out altogether. Holt decided it was best to seal the mine's entrance and bury the creatures within. Whatever the evil Reverend unleashed could not spread into the village. Not to mention, no man in Willow Fork would dare step foot in the mine knowing what now lurked within. A few of the men asked about Jake. Should they go and rescue him? Holt shook his head. Jake was probably dead, or perhaps one of them now. It was best to seal him inside. Pop numbly nodded in agreement and helped in wiring the explosives and quarter sticks around the mouth of the mine. They detonated the charges, and in a cloud of dust and rock the mine was sealed. The explosion echoed off the stoic green mountains, as if they too agreed with the decision. That evening, Pop came home but didn't say anything, even as Granny and the children asked about Jake and the explosion. He said nothing, but did something he hadn't done in years. He went to the cupboard and pulled out a bottle of whiskey. Granny kept it for when she became ill. Sitting at the simple wooden table, Pop poured himself a drink and downed it in silence. Granny had put the children to bed despite their protests and joined Pop in the kitchen. After a few more drinks, he simply told her that they were leaving tomorrow and moving to Farco, another coal camp to the east. He didn't explain why, but his words were final. In the morning, they weren't the only ones to be leaving Willow Fork, and by the end of the week, the entire town had been abandoned. It wouldn't be for many years until Pop finally told Granny about that day. It was shortly before he died, and maybe he was feeling guilty for letting his friend, Jake Whittaker, go into that mine, only to be sealed within. Granny sits in silence after finishing the story. The night is dark now, and the frogs sing in the pond down in the pasture. The watermelon's been long forgotten. I say nothing, but now the mountains look more menacing in the blackness. Granny simply shakes her head and sighs. I'm the only person she had ever shared that story with, and I know she wouldn't make these things up. Of course, the mine is sealed, and Willow Fork isn't even on the map. Whatever still remains in that mine is trapped within and can't get at us. We're safe in the hills. They keep our secrets and our sins. Only lately I've been watching the news, and I hear that they're looking to revive the mining industry in what was Willow Fork. I know it's still talk, but the demand for coal is high, and West Virginia will do anything to keep the industry alive. I wonder if they do reopen the mine, what they'll find in the old shafts. One can only keep a secret for so long.